The month you were born is not your personality, but it did shape the biological conditions your personality developed inside. And the research on exactly how it did that has been building quietly for decades, completely separate from anything you'd find in a horoscope. Epidemiologists, neuroscientists, and developmental psychologists have been studying birth month through population data, brain chemistry, and classroom records spanning millions of people. They didn't need the stars. They had something more useful: evidence. The month you arrived affected how your brain developed in its earliest weeks, your stress response, your classroom experience, your brain's chemical starting point. Each of these left a specific, measurable mark. And one finding in this research, the one about what happens at the absolute top of elite sport, turned everything researchers thought they knew completely upside down. We will get there. In this video, we're going through 4 findings: the classroom effect, the brain chemistry of birth season, the stress resilience patterns, and that inversion. 4 findings. Let's look at what the month you arrived actually did. The accidental experiment. At some point in the mid-20th century, governments around the world made an administrative decision that accidentally became one of the largest uncontrolled experiments in human development ever run. They set school enrollment cutoff dates, one fixed date per year that decided which children entered the same classroom together. Children born across a 12-month window, some almost a full year older than others, were placed in the same learning environment and measured against the same standards. Children born in the months immediately after the enrollment cutoff are consistently the oldest in their class. A study analyzing academic and behavioral records from over 35 million students across multiple countries found that the oldest children in each year group significantly outperformed younger classmates in academic assessments, were more frequently identified as gifted, and were more often selected for leadership roles throughout their school years. The mechanism is not intelligence. It is developmental timing meeting institutional expectation. A child who is 11 months older than their youngest classmate enters the same room with 11 months of additional brain development. In the early years of school, when the brain is building its foundational confidence, social identity, and academic self-concept, 11 months is an enormous gap. Teachers read the difference as ability. The child reads the feedback as identity. The brain builds accordingly. If you were born in the months just after your country's school cutoff, the confidence and capability you felt in those early years was real, but it was partly a product of timing rather than fixed ability. If you were born in the months just before the cutoff, making you the youngest in every class you ever sat in, the friction you felt was also real, and it was also partly a product of timing. Neither experience was the full picture, but both left marks that researchers can still measure in adult outcomes decades later. Before the first breath. Before you took your first breath, the season outside was already shaping the chemical environment your brain was developing inside. Not through any mystical mechanism, through vitamin D, light exposure, and the specific hormonal conditions of the final months of pregnancy. Multiple large-scale population studies have found measurable differences in dopamine regulation and serotonin baseline levels between people born in different seasons. Winter and early spring births show specific differences in how dopamine pathways function compared to summer births. Differences consistent enough across independent research datasets to have generated serious attention in psychiatry and neuroscience. During the final 3 months of pregnancy, the mother's vitamin D levels, which change significantly by season due to sunlight exposure, directly influence the developing brain's chemical architecture. Low maternal vitamin D in the 3rd trimester has been linked to altered dopamine pathway development in the fetal brain. The chain is simple. The season determined the sunlight influenced the vitamin D shaped the brain's early chemical starting point. This does not mean your personality was fixed by the weather outside when you were born. It means the chemical conditions your brain first developed under varied in real, measurable ways depending on the season, and those conditions had nothing to do with which constellation the sun was passing through at the time. Biology set the starting point. What the brain did from there was its own work. The finding they weren't looking for. Researchers studying seasonal patterns in mental health outcomes were not looking for a stress resilience finding when they began. They were mapping something else, seasonal variation in psychiatric diagnosis rates. What kept appearing in the data alongside what they were looking for was unexpected enough that several independent teams went back and ran the analysis again. Population studies across multiple countries have found that birth month correlates with specific stress response patterns in adulthood. Summer births, particularly June, July, and August in the Northern Hemisphere, show measurably different cortisol regulation compared to winter births across several large independent datasets. The first months of life outside the womb are a critical window for the brain's internal clock calibration. Infants born in summer experience long days, strong light, and clear signals that help the brain's clock establish itself. Infants born in winter experience shorter days, lower light levels, and a more ambiguous environment during that same window. The stress response system and the internal clock system are deeply connected. A more clearly established clock in early infancy appears to support more stable stress regulation into adulthood. If you have always found that you regulate stress more easily than the people around you, or that stress management genuinely feels harder for you than it seems to be for others, the month you were born may have contributed to the baseline you have been working with your entire life. Not as a fixed ceiling, as a starting point shaped by a biological window you had no control over. That covers the 3 biological starting conditions: the classroom timing, the brain chemistry, the stress baseline. What comes next is the finding that flipped all of it upside down, and it changes how you read everything that came before. The relative age effect, the classroom advantage for older children, is one of the most thoroughly documented findings in developmental psychology. Being the oldest in the room during your formative years produces real, measurable advantages. The research on this is not disputed. So researchers assumed the same pattern would hold at the highest levels of competitive sport. More early resources, more early identification, more coaching attention for the relatively older athletes. More relatively older athletes reaching the elite level. The data confirmed this. Early-born athletes were overrepresented at the professional level. The finding held. Then a research team asked a different question. Not who makes it to the professional level, who reaches the absolute top of it. World number ones, Olympic champions. The athletes who do not just compete at the elite level, but define it. The birth month distribution inverted. Athletes born later in the selection year, the ones who had been the youngest in every development program, overlooked, cut from teams earlier, given less coaching attention, and forced to work harder for every opportunity they got, were overrepresented at the very top of their sports. The mechanism the researchers identified was the same one running quietly through this entire video. The children who experienced the relative age disadvantage early built something the advantaged ones did not have to build: greater resilience under pressure, more resourceful problem solving, a tolerance for difficulty that came from difficulty being the normal condition of their development, not the exception. The month that made everything harder in the beginning was quietly building something the easier months were not. Here is what all of this means put together. Your birth month shaped your starting conditions. The classroom timing, the brain chemistry, the stress baseline, all of it left marks. But the elite inversion finding points at something the rest of the data doesn't. The starting conditions are not the outcome. The people who had the harder starting point built something the easier starting point never required them to build. The month gave you the conditions. Everything built inside those conditions was yours. Not astrology, not destiny. Just biology, timing, and what the brain quietly built when the conditions required it to. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.